colleagues, I want to bring to your attention a small study on religious policy in the Soviet Union, which is based more on a historical approach than on a religious study. In recent years, documents that previously were not available appear from archives, and they allow us to see events in a slightly different way, change assessments, and change our view of relations between the state and religion. In this presentation, I used not only historical documents, but also partially photographs taken by Sergei Prokudin-Gorsky, a photographer of the Russian Geographical Society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, using the technology he invented. At that time, he was making not only black and white, but also color photographs of the Turkestan region of very high quality. The volatile nature of the religious policy of the Soviet government was characterized by variability and voluntarism, depending on the tasks and interests of a particular historical stage. If there was a need for broad support from the masses, the attitude to religion, ethnic and historical characteristics of peoples became tolerant and neutral. Nonetheless, the growing sense of strength and unity around the slogans and values of the dominant ideology has led state and party functionaries to more and more severely deal with religion, beliefs, lifestyles and customs, especially during periods of persecution, repression and the fight against dissent. Decades of militant atheism gave way to years of thaw and neutrality, and again to active uprooting of religious consciousness. On January 23, 1918, a decree of the Council of People's Commissars on the separation of the church from the state and the school from the church was published. According to this decree, all religions were equalized in their rights, and none of them could take advantage of the support of state power and the maintenance of funds belonging to the whole people. In reality, in the era of militant atheism of the 30s, during the Stalinist repressions of 1936-1937, tens of thousands of clergy were arrested and executed as representatives of a hostile ideology. The country's leadership initially believed that when the church was deprived of power, religion would die quickly. However, when this didn't happen, efforts to combat it doubled. In the next stage, during World War II, there was a sharp warming. The persecution of priests stopped, churches began to reopen. However, in the 1950s, a new phase of persecution of the church began. Religion began to be considered a remnant of capitalism in the consciousness and behavior of people, and believers were often not repressed, but they were re-educated. In relation to Islam and Muslims, government policy had some specific features. In the first years of Soviet power, religion's freedom seemed to be promised by the new government along with other freedoms and rights to all working people of the East. On November 20, 1917, the address of the Soviet government to all working Muslims of Russia and the East was adopted, which said, "All those whose mosques and chapels were destroyed, whose traditions and customs were violated by the Tsars and oppressors of Russia, from now on your beliefs and customs, your national and cultural institutions are declared free and inviolable." Until 1929, the official policy regarding Islam was the most favorable compared to the line pursued in relation to other confessions and religious groups. The activity of religious courts was allowed, which decided cases according to Shariat, though the courts of Qazi were strictly subordinate to the Soviet authorities. In 1920, in Ufa, under the chairmanship of Mufti Galmjan Barudi, the All-Russian Congress of Muslims was held, at which the Central Spiritual Administration of Muslims was created. Moreover, the government supported certain initiatives of the clergy, and the clergy, in turn, declared their loyalty to state structures and politics. Soviet power in Central Asia needed widespread support, for example, calling on the masses to mobilization work, that is, working in wartime conditions, building roads, factories, carrying out various duties, requisitions, and campaigns. Representatives of the clergy not only participated in the events of the Soviet government, but also often took part in official bodies for their implementation. Paradoxically, along with the physical destruction of part of the clergy, the destruction of religious buildings, the development of atheistic propaganda, special bodies were created to manage the religious life of the population, such as the Spiritual Administration of Muslims in Central Asia and Kazakhstan in Tashkent in 1943, the Spiritual Administrations of Muslims of Transcaucasia in Baku, the North Caucasus in Buynaksk, the European part of the USSR and Siberia in Ufa. In the post-war period, these spiritual administrations were under the control of the State Security Committee and were forced to issue fatwas on the recommendation of the Soviet authorities, even if the content of the fatwas was contrary to Islamic dogma. In the post-war period, Soviet Islam simultaneously existed in two versions, official and illegal. Official Islam was represented in 400 to 500 mosques in the USSR, several hundred of clergymen, the official journal Muslims of the Soviet East, aimed at foreigners. The official religious education was presented by the Mir Arab Madrasa in Bukhara and by the Imam al-Bukhari Islamic Institute in Tashkent. Permissions for its opening was given in 1971. Since the late 1960s, spiritual administration has also sent students to study in religious schools of the USSR's friendly Egypt, Libya, and Syria. Every year from 1953 to 1989, about 20 people, carefully selected by the Soviet authorities, were sent to the Hajj. Islamic clergy had to conduct propaganda for foreigners that the USSR has freedom of conscience and engage in ideological support for the Soviet system. As an opposition to official clericalism, there was Ishanism, an unofficial clergy in which, along with Sufi views, elements of the traditional social system were absorbed. Khoja, Ishan, Sheikh, or Shrakshe were respected by Kazakhs. The attitude towards the representatives of the Khoja clan in Kazakhstan, as well as throughout Central Asia, has always been special, recognizing the holiness of the descendants of the family of the Prophet Muhammad, as they were called. Representatives of these families were considered Ishans and Pirs, who were the upper strata of the Muslim clergy, and they also considered themselves Sufis and the spiritual elite. According to Muslim genealogies, the origin of Khoja gave them the right to a special status and a certain place in socio-political life. However, the social status required them to be responsible and persistent even in conditions unfavorable for the existence of religious practices and religion in general. It would be a mistake to consider them to be people divorced from reality, completely immersed in mystical experiences, living in isolation from society. The times of Sufism in its classical form have passed, in any case, in Kazakhstan of the social era. They had to use argumentation and language that was understandable both to the murids, ordinary followers of the religion, and to the Soviet bureaucracy, to talk about high and low, spiritual and material, depending on the audience, to survive in conditions of political repression and militant atheism. Some recently declassified documents from the State Archive, as well as interviews with family members of Imam Khoja Zunun Zupinov, allowed me to get information about the life and work of this representative of the Sufi tradition, which gives an idea of the existence of unofficial versions of religious discourse in Soviet Kazakhstan. According to contemporaries and members of his large family, Zunun Zupinov was a charismatic figure, an extraordinary person who, having received a local education, never traveled abroad to study in Arab countries. By the age of 15 to 16, Khoja Zunun remembered the text of the Quran and became a qari. In the 30s, when the Stalinist repressions began, Khoja Zunun, as a deeply religious man, trained by two teachers, the Sufis of Naqshbandiya, received ijazah from one of them and was forced to hide. His family went to the desert regions of Talas and then to Moinkum, and in 1938 he changed his surname, taking the name of his mother. Later, He got a job as a fireman in a depot in Jambal. In the war years 1941 to 45, he proved himself so professional that the commission of the military commissariat appointed him a locomotive driver, and he worked in this position until 1948. Events of his later life can be traced on the basis of secret documents and reports sent to the Council of Religious Cults under the Council of Ministers of the USSR. The controlling and punishing functions of this organ are well described in some research papers. According to the report, there was a group of registered Muslim committees in Jambal city. The mullah imam of this mosque is Zupinov Zunnun. The number of Muslim believers is large, mainly during the holidays. They do not even fit into the mosque. In addition, Muslims from neighboring regions take part in these holidays. An estimated number of believers is between 3,000 and 3,500 during holidays. This is the end of the quote. The process of growing popularity and attracting believers went so fast that the spiritual administration of Muslims assessed it as an increasing competition of the Sufi imam and the threat of losing the authority of official Islam. The attitude towards Ishans in Soviet times was always wary and suspicious. The spiritual administration of Muslims of Central Asia and Kazakhstan issued a number of special decisions, fatwas, in which it denounced Ishanism, recognized it as an innovation and delusion, and also instructed the official imams to fight Ishans. The muftis of the spiritual administration conducted a certain struggle against competitors, as can be seen from another report for the second quarter of 1950, which says that for about a year there have been disagreements and discontent among believers in the Muslim community of Jambal. Some of them accuse Imam Zupinov of discussing government policy instead of preaching, prohibition of receiving money for performing rituals. The representative of the spiritual administration of Central Asia organized a meeting of believers during which the vast majority of believers supported Imam Zupinov. Nevertheless, the spiritual administration appointed another person as Imam of the mosque. In the 1950s, the existence of Islamic authorities recognized by the Soviet government and authorities not fully recognized was not such a rare occurrence, as well as conflicts between them using means non-traditional for the religious sphere, such as appeals to public opinion, complaints to higher secular and religious institutions, intrigues and scandals. The hostility and opposition of the spiritual administration nevertheless led to the removal of Khoja Zunnun from the imam's post, although for some time he tried to defend his right to preach from the official mimbar. Zunnun Zupinov's disagreements with the official body didn't go unnoticed, and the accusations of political unreliability led to the fact that only a month after the outbreak of the conflict, on November 1953, he was charged under the article of the Criminal Code, propaganda or agitation directed to incitement of national or religious hatred, as well as distribution or production and storage of literature of the same nature, and was sentenced to 2 years in a forced labor camp. Stay in prison didn't break the spirit of Sheikh Zunnun. After his release from prison, Khoja Zunnun remained under vigilant control by the authorities, and his subsequent activities were reflected in the next report of the representative of the Council for Religious Cults, Zaur Khalif. He writes, "Again, a struggle broke out between the Muslim community of Jambal and a group of the former Imam of the mosque, Zunnun Zupinov. He and his group voluntarily conduct prayer services on separate collective farms of the Talas and Jambal districts, although he didn't and doesn't have any right to do this. So, for example, in 1955, Zunnun Zupinov during the Eid al-Adha in the village behind the Jambal station separately held Eid Namaz, in which about 600 people took part, collected large sums of money. With the money raised, Zupinov built a 5-room house, where one room is intended for a mosque, where he is going to become a mullah. Zupinov and his group are struggling to disorganize, demoralize, and upset the current leaders of the Jambul mosques. The end of quote. And then the representative of the Council for Religious Cults requires direct intervention of the Council on this very serious issue, since, he writes, further postponement of this issue may lead to undesirable results. This report most clearly shows the extreme concern of the system, which can only apply repressive measures in the struggle for the minds of citizens. There was no doubt that the path to an official position was closed to Khoja Zunnun. The opposition of the authorities became more and more dangerous, and he began the life of a Sufi murshid, standing aside from the political struggle against the state system. His reputation as a Naqshbandi Sufi was so high that he quickly acquired murids, students from all Muslim republics. He also traveled to the southern, western, and central regions of the country. For 30 years he professed the Quran and taught tafsir. There were different stories from the life of Khoja Zunnun, similar to Sufi hagiography. It is obvious that in times of uncertainty about tomorrow, fear of uncontrolled crisis, in an atmosphere of distrust of state and party officials, ordinary people, especially in provinces and rural areas, need someone who has the karama, can protect them with his prayers. When Ishan traveled through the villages, people everywhere greeted him with reverence. Slaughtered cattle, covered blankets in open areas where many believers gathered, and he gave his instructions there. His preaching work was mainly oral, as well as the activities of some other Sufi sheikhs of this period. The ability of Sheikh Zunnun to attract people, his high authority and charisma, led to a number of spiritual leaders of the Central Asian republics asking him to leave from Moscow with a petition to the Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, to open for visiting the mausoleum and mosque of Khoja Ahmed Yassawi in Turkestan, and he did it. The biography and trajectory of Khoja Zunnun's life give us a picture which includes both the historical stages in the fate of the peoples of Kazakhstan, sharp turns in the religious policy of the Soviet state, and the desire of the clergyman to preserve his religious views, supporting the impulses of the Sufi tradition in the most severe conditions of the dominance of communist ideology. The sharp condemnation and rejection of official Islam, sponsored and ruled by state authorities, puts Sufism on the position of the Muslim ideological opposition. But the activities of Zunnun Zupinov demonstrate that the general complication of religious life, accompanied by harsh ideological pressure, gave impetus to the development of Sufism in its more popular than philosophical and mystical forms. Thank you for attention.